So good evening and welcome back to our second Zoom session for 2021. It's great to be back. Welcome to all of our regulars and welcome to any people who are here for the first time this week. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association and I am again your MC for this.
Oh, Alan, you've gone mute. Need to unmute yourself, mate. Okay, you're back.
Okay, so where are we? There we are. So also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Ross Cameron, who we will introduce in a moment. The topic tonight is Prospective Issues 2021, and at not even 1 month old, this year is barely out of holiday season, yet we already have a stack of issues to discuss. It's the usual format. David will chat with Ross for about 30 minutes, at which point we will open up the discussion to questions from the audience. Now, just before we start, I wanted to mention that the AJA is always looking for interested people in Melbourne or Sydney to get involved with our organisation. So if you, your children or even your grandchildren like what we do and have some skills we could utilise, we would be very interested in chatting to them. The way to get in touch with us, of course, is office@jewishassociation.org.au. Okay, now Ross Cameron will be well known to this audience as a former Liberal politician for the division of Parramatta from 1996 until 2004. Between 2013 and 2018, he was a contributor and host at Sky News Live, including a stint as a co-host of Outsiders, of course, with Rowan Dean. And we have a little clip of that. And David, if you could roll that tape, please.
I just say the conservative mind says, do not invent something new if there is already a beautiful solution available to you which someone else has invented. And basically the Jews have already invented everything. So don't waste your time. Just have the humility. As far as I know, I don't have a drop of Jewish blood in my body, but I would be absolutely honoured and delighted if I did. And I just want to say to the Arab world, you've got, 350 million Arabs in 22 countries. You pride yourself, the Arab sort of Bedouin culture prides itself on hospitality. I just want to say to you that I don't think your policy of punting the Jews is in your interest. And I think if you just sat down for a moment and said, okay, we've got this little rare jewel of 6.5 million Jews in the state of Israel of 8 million people. This is one of the best things going for the Middle East. This is what I have described previously as the magic in this operation. So wherever you are in the world, if you have a Jewish neighbour, say God bless you. When you see a Jew walking on the street, you should recognise an ancestor of King David and say, this is absolutely the most awesome story of human survival ever written.
Yeah, well said. Ross is a lawyer by training and has worked for Macquarie Bank and has been described as brilliant, often controversial, with the latter characteristics sometimes getting him into trouble. He's been an outstanding supporter of Israel and the Jewish community. In 2018, was named one of the top 100 influencers on Jewish life. Ross, thank you for your time and welcome to our AJA Zoom session.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm going to hand you over to David, who'll start off the discussion.
Okay, well, Ross, it's a delight to have you finally on an AJA event and to get your political insights into what we might be facing in the year ahead. And I've got to tell you that I don't think I have ever had a higher level of apprehension at the beginning of a year than the beginning of 2021. So from your perspective, is my apprehension well-founded? What do you see as the major issues?
Well, a lot of people feel that way at the beginning of a discussion with me, I must suggest. But no, I have to agree with you, David, that we are in a nadir. And I would say that the United States, for example, is at its lowest point since the Civil War. I think it's important to ask ourselves simple questions, to start to step back and to see the forest rather than the trees, and ask ourselves, is our culture, is our nation, is our civilization on the ascent or the descent? Plato famously inscribed on the gate at the entry to his academy, let no one unfamiliar with geometry enter here. And geometry offers us this option of is something on decline or is the angle on ascent? And one of the problems is when your culture falls into decline, as indeed every culture does, just as every species is either growing or dying, every organism, every nation, I think it's time for us to admit that we are in a deep trough, and there is a very significant question about whether we can be pulled out of this trough. And if we take the most basic indicator of all, we can go to the day-to-day static, the kind of background noise, the headlines. But just one fact is that, you know, by 2019, the Australian birth rate, demography is destiny, the Australian birth rate had fallen to its lowest level ever at, I think, 1.65 births per female in the population. So as a consequence of COVID, we are now down well into the 1.5s. And we are at least 60,000 live births a year, below what Josh Frydenberg predicted we would be in his 2019 budget. So 60,000 live births, assuming a life expectancy of 80 years each, 60,000 times 80, that's literally millions of years of Australian life, which has been wiped out because as a culture, for whatever combination of reasons, we no longer possess the will to survive.
Well, one of the there are a few big events which occurred during 2020 which have spilled over into 2021, and I'd like to ask you about each of them in turn. The most recent, of course, has been the US presidential election, and we've seen a change of administration from the Trump administration to the Biden-Harris administration. I'm not sure, maybe it's Harris-Biden administration. What's your view of the impact of the new administration in the US? How significant is it?
Yeah, well, I regard it as you know, the leadership of the Western world, which is what the United States has been for effectively since the First World War, for over 100 years, is an important question, arguably the most important election which takes place anywhere in the world. We wind up in a situation where whatever you and I whatever view we may have formed individually about whether that election result actually reflects the will of the American people. We know that 1/3 of all Americans don't trust the result of their own election, 1/3. Because they have a situation where you have an incumbent president who won more votes than any incumbent in the history of the United States, but still lost to a bloke who could barely fill a Toyota Hiace with his supporters. And there's a range of reasons why people, you know, may or may not be skeptical about it, but whatever your or my view, we know that 1/3 of Americans no longer trust the United States to run a democratic election. Indeed, it seems to me likely that future American presidential elections will require the services of international observers. And, you know, if we look at the rate of decline in the United States, we wind up in a situation where New York City, allegedly the leader of global capitalism, yet Dolce & Gabbana can't open a store on Fifth Avenue because the joint will be arsoned and looted. We've had 50 American cities suffering over $2,000 million worth of arson and looting over the past since the death of George Floyd. We've got the city of Portland still essentially on fire. So when you're in a situation where we've got to turn around to the rest of the world, to the emerging economies, to the one-party states, we're going to go to the Chinese Communist Party and say, oh, we really think you should reconsider this whole one-party state, because look at our champion, look at our Goliath, who can't run an election, which the American people will trust the result. His entire tertiary education system is just an indoctrination club, whose government is, in truth, the American state is better described as a swamp, and who now are engaged in this internal, deeply divided, where the left in America effectively hates a majority of the American people. We, as an ally of the United States, we've got a big problem.
Well, they're the leaders of Western civilization, Ross, the Judeo-Christian ethic, if you like.
Yeah.
It's terribly important, and we have a special interest, obviously, in Israel advocacy. And we've seen, even within the last 48 hours, some appointments of people who have been anti-Israel, bordering on anti-Semitic in some of their statements in the past. The PLO mission in Washington is going to be reopened, possibly, very likely, more money going into the Palestinian Authority and into UNRWA. So you're right. I mean, the US has a lot of downstream effects. Australia, what about Australia, the impact here?
Well, the biggest, in truth, the biggest risk that we face is in the China relationship.
Right.
And that's a risk because Australia decided, Australia is the individual country which is most highly exposed to the Chinese economy. So in 2019, China bought 40% of Australia's export product, goods and services.
Enormous.
In the same year, Australia bought less than 2% of China's export product. So what you see is a total asymmetry in the relationship between our country and their country. Now, we charged down a path of, I would describe it as, let's destroy the China trade relationship, made a 180-degree turn after bipartisan support from Scott Whitlam to integrate these two economies, the Australian economy and the Chinese economy, on the basis that as the middle class of China grew by tens of millions each year, that growth would then lift the Australian economy, which was fully enmeshed in tourism, in education, in agricultural product, and obviously in the resources sector. And that compact over 4 decades, we had Australia as the fastest growing first world economy, and China as the fastest growing developing economy. And that was no coincidence. Then all of a sudden we decided, Maurice Payne wandered out one day after meeting with a group of American admirals and announced that China was Australia's enemy. Now, let's be fair and say that there is actually quite a bit of support in the Australian people for a toughening up of the stance towards China, and indeed of Scott Morrison deciding that Australia would, in effect, move the motion to hold China to account for the COVID Wuhan flu. Now, all of that is well and good, David, but the difficulty we now have is we know that the Biden family is also deeply enmeshed in the China economy. I think anybody, you know, we don't know for a fact, it hasn't been subject to a criminal investigation, but I think looking on the data that we have, it would not be irrational to assume that the President of the United States is indeed the, quote, big guy, referred to as private correspondence, who was to acquire 10% of the equity in the venture between Hunter Biden and his other partners and a number of senior, in major contracts going to China. Putting the Biden family's interest to one side, the risk that Australia now faces is that an incoming Biden administration will reverse the Trump confrontational approach to China, will aim to rebuild the commercial relationship, repair the flows of trade and investment, and Australia will fall between stools. And this risk is exacerbated by the fact that the European community on the 30th of December announced that it had, after 7 years of negotiation, formalised a comprehensive trade treaty between Europe and China, in which for the first time, for example, the Volkswagen Motor Corporation is able to announce that it has been granted a majority ownership of a joint venture in the manufacture of motor vehicles in China. So we could easily have a situation where Australia, having in effect poked the, poked the bear in the eye, poked the panda at least, that Europe then wraps its arms around China, as it's obviously doing, acting, purely led by the German Chancellor, who's made very strong statements at Davos, even over the last 48 hours, indicating that they wish to accelerate German and European engagement with China. So if we have a significant turnaround in the US relationship with China, Australia will be dumped like a sack of potatoes, stone, motherless, last, friendless, in a world which is embracing China. So I hope we're all enjoying the warm inner glow because the guys who've been buying 40% of our exports are about to teach Australians a lesson.
Where does the Victorian Belt and Road Initiative fit into this? It's been widely criticised, as you know, and I think the federal government has introduced legislation which gives it the power to annul that agreement, but has not actually proceeded to do so. What's your view on the BRI that Victoria's in?
Well, look, we could take a step back and say, well, what do we think of the Belt and Road Initiative as a whole? And, this is an area where I'm going to, fully utilise the rabbinical Talmudic tradition of entertaining a range of different views as we seek to find the truth. I think, in the minority, certainly among conservatives. I accept on this matter that I am regarded by some as a bit of an outlier, but if I take the Socratic approach and follow the argument like a ship blown on the water wherever the wind may blow me, I think Chinese foreign policy is not only superior to Australian or US foreign policy, but vastly superior, obviously superior. And if you look at American and Australian foreign policy over the last 2 decades, we've effectively blundered into and out of a war in Afghanistan. We have wanted into a war in Iraq and out, and then back in again. We have proven quite good at regime change, but absolutely hopeless at building peace on the other side. You know, we have created a civil war in Libya, for which there is no obvious answer, entirely sponsored by Hillary Clinton. We have spent, 6 years seeking to destabilise the national government of Syria. And then eventually, after going into alliance with the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade in order to achieve our objectives, we have then wandered back out of Syria, you know, minus 50 Tomahawk missiles. Western foreign policy is totally incoherent. We have the United States, when Hillary Clinton woke up in a drunken hangover because she'd been so hammered she couldn't even make a concession speech. Everybody, John Podesta and the lads, sat around and said, well, how are we going to explain the fact that we just got beaten by Donald Trump? And so the whole of the US foreign policy establishment said, well, let's blame Russia. Let's blame Russian interference. So thoughtful people like you and I and, you know, Iqbal the taxi driver can see straight through the garbage pouring out of US foreign policy establishment that Russia did it. We've had to endure the stupidity of the Mueller investigation. We have seen, you know, this, so because of the weakness and vulnerability of the United States, we have had to endure this completely baseless assault on the reputation of the Russian Federation. This is Western foreign policy. Now, by contrast,
the Chinese, the Chinese are certainly disciplined, way more disciplined, way more focused. I'm not sure whether I'd describe some of their implementation in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Tibet, etc., with the word quality. If you're a conservative who values freedoms and you know, justice and, you know, separation of powers and all these sort of things. So discipline, I think, is probably a more accurate description.
Yeah. Look, I understand that plenty of people of good faith hold a different opinion to mine. But if we consider the possible directions that China could have gone, and we look at North Korea, which essentially China was a version of North Korea at the time of Chairman Mao, and we've had a succession of Chinese leaders, essentially since, I would say, 1980, who have accepted the invitation extended to China by the Western world to say, we don't wish you to be a hermit kingdom, we want you to participate. And it could have gone a number of different ways. But what we find is that there is the Chinese Communist Party, love them or hate them. We can't dispute the fact they've lifted 1,000 million people out of poverty in 4 decades. So let's start with the facts. So then we can move from there and we can say, if we say, well, how many bombs have we, the Five Eyes Alliance, NATO, how many bombs have we dropped in the last 4 decades? And how many bombs have the Chinese dropped? If I was getting paid $1 per bomb, I know whose side I'd rather be on. But I just want to say to you, David, that the idea of the Belt and Road, I mean, this is the problem the Chinese have got, is that their economies are more productive than ours. They've got more foreign reserves than ours. In moving 1,000 million people from villages to cities, they've acquired this extraordinary engineering capability in building roads and power stations and ports and bridges. And so they're saying, well, what are we going to do with it? So Xi Jinping says, well, let's create a foreign policy where we take all that engineering capability and we take our foreign currency reserves, we lend it to other nations to deploy our ability to build roads and power stations and bridges and ports and airports and water treatment plants. Now, if the rest of the world is going to... Now, Maurice Payne goes into a foreign country and the first thing she says is, you don't have enough gender fluidity in the boards on your stock exchange. That's her best idea. The Chinese ambassador walks into the same boardroom and says, do you want us to build you a new port in Vanuatu? Or do you want us to build a highway through the highlands of Papua New Guinea? Guess which side, you know, Maurice Payne will say, oh, you haven't built enough windmills to lower the temperature of the planet. The Chinese will say, oh, you've got pensioners dying of cold because they can't afford to heat their homes, so why don't you let us build you a coal-fired power station? I'm saying to you, David, that in the various, I mean, I want to cheer for my own side, but I have to say in the quality of foreign policy, the Chinese are laps ahead of the Western world.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time, but I just want you to get you to touch on a couple of issues briefly. Donald Trump, from our perspective, his Middle East policy, there are deliverables there. The general umbrella is called the Abraham Accords. Your view?
Well, I just think this is one of the obvious, immediate, you know, moments where I feel like right now standing up in my chair and saluting Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the royal family of the United Arab Emirates. You know, the government of Sudan, of Bhutan. I mean, the momentum was there. This is a magnificent achievement. And, you know, I was watching a like 2016 Saturday Night Live comedy sketch from CJ Turner, or someone, I forget who the comedian was. He said, look, everything has changed. I grew up in the 1970s. Everything has changed since the 1970s, except the Middle East. And, you know, this ongoing permanent war in the Middle East seemed to be a feature of your lifetime and mine that was never going to go away. And one outsider property developer from New York comes along and says, you know what, I don't buy it. I don't buy that we must live in permanent war with Israel. And they set about to create peace. And they've produced a peace with 4 nations. And they were really saying Indonesia, it was the hope for next cab off the rank that we could get. You know, Jared Kushner was saying, we hope to get to 2025. We might be able to reach every Muslim majority nation in the world. I mean, I see that Pakistan has just had a demonstration of 1 million people in an opposition party opposing peace with Israel. But the problem for the peace in Israel, the geometry in Plato's terms, has always been, in my view, not well understood, was the extent to which the leadership of authoritarian governments in either Arab or Islamic majority nations who derived their capital for re-election by fostering hatred towards Israel, so that when we had someone like Ehud Barak, who came along and offered Yasser Arafat the most generous deal that is possible to conceive in relation to, you know, land, water security and the right of return. He went as far out as anyone could imagine or hope, and he was knocked back. And the question is why? And the reason is because so many other nations who have nothing to do with this immediate little piece of land in the Levant, you know, they were all cheering for continuous war. And Donald Trump said, no, I'm not buying it. We're going to lift our sights and our expectations. And it seems to me we've immediately moved back into a business as usual, permanent war, you know, feed Lockheed Martin you know, and feed violence in this region. And that's what we can expect from the Biden administration. I desperately hope I'm wrong, but that is my current expectation.
Well, I'm unfortunately with you on that. I'll give you an opportunity now just to make one comment on an issue that's been a niche issue of yours, and that is Julian Assange, who, you know, it's not a core issue of ours, but to see an Australian citizen locked up for so many years or hiding for so many years, and I've listened to both sides of the arguments. On the one hand, the freedom of information argument, on the other, that he crossed red lines in putting certain security risks that were breached. make a statement about your view and what might happen in 2021 with Julian Assange.
Well, look, David, I really appreciate you asking me the question because there's plenty of people who prefer to avoid it. And I just say to you that I also understand that that, like, say, my view on China, that not everyone on the conservative side shares my view on Assange, on WikiLeaks. But it just became clear to me over time, if we go down to the practical realities of data, what is clear is that the big state is not capable of keeping our data secure. The big state is not capable of managing the fact that it runs these incredibly complex information systems, which have to be maintained by a multiplicity of contractors, and then which also have to deal with the risk of the insider who becomes disillusioned with what they see and who leaks. And you've got those two sets of issues arising even before you get to the risk of an external hack, which is what is usually blamed for data breach, usually falsely. And so the question arises, well, what do we do, since so much of our lives have moved from the analog realm of conversation to the digital realm of bits? What do we do when government, like the milkmaid going down a steep grassy slope with dewy morning, trying to carry buckets of milk, and it's just sloshing out to the left and to the right? Where does that data go? What do we do with it? And the big state has no answer to this question. And Julian Assange, and I understand the distaste for leaking among your audience, which I entirely share. I don't wish in any way to encourage leaking. I wish to encourage the security of data. But whether you are talking about a health insurer, the Roads and Traffic Authority, or the the Federal Bureau of Investigation, our data is not secure. WikiLeaks says, well, what should be done with it is it should be published accurately. And so it should not be the province purely of a small number of intelligence services from, in many cases, hostile nations, or from organised criminals, or from a group of insiders who are profiting from it. It should be published fairly, fearlessly, transparently, whether whoever it affects. And you say to me, you've got concerns about the separation of powers. Well, I say to you that the British judiciary, which gave us Blackstone, the common law, the Privy Council, it has been entirely suborned to MI6 and GCHQ. It is merely a branch of the executive government of the United Kingdom. And likewise, the idea that the United States is asserting a right, an extraterritorial jurisdiction to detain and imprison an Australian journalist who has won a Walkley Award for his absolute fanatical commitment to accuracy and transparency of what he publishes. And they wish to put this bloke, already detained, almost dead, in the oldest and coldest prison in the United Kingdom, who hasn't even been issued with winter clothing, who hasn't been able to speak to his lawyers personally since March of last year, and you want to say to me that there is a separation of powers being observed in relation to Julian Assange. David, it's bullshit. It is absolute garbage. It is a disgrace to the Australian government. There's not a single member. George Christensen gets points. We've got only 2 members of the coalition are friends of the Assange group, because everyone else is protecting their future career prospects rather than defending the rights of an Australian citizen. And if the currency of an Australian passport means anything, it has to mean it when a bloke is in trouble. And that's right now. He's being bullied, he's being belted around, he's being effectively tortured. And as an Australian, I am deeply humiliated and embarrassed by the performance of our government in his case.
Okay, well, thank you, Ross. That's why we wanted to bring you on, to get direct opinions without the fluff. Alan, if you'd like to invite questions, that would be a good time now.
Okay, so thanks, David. Now, our regular people know how to ask a question. But if anybody is new to these sessions, what we ask you to do is click on the participants icon at the bottom, and there'll be a symbol that says raise hand. That lets us know that you want to ask a question, and then we'll come to you in turn. So I've got Ron, Ruven and Ailey, and then I'll read out a question from the chat. So just before we go to Ron, Ross, you touched on the American election, if I may ask you, and you quite correctly said that there was questions about the veracity of it. Tell me, do you have a view on whether the election was free and fair?
Look, I'm sceptical about the result. Okay, as a former marginal seat campaigner, okay, I fought 4 marginal seat campaigns. I know how hard it is to get a voter's bum on a seat in a scout hall to listen, to take the benefit, as you are tonight, of my extraordinary wisdom. You know, I know how hard a candidate has to work to get a punter to turn up and say, I'm interested in hearing your opinion. Donald Trump filled a stadium in Florida with 20,000 people on 2 hours' notice in the last day of the campaign. Okay. What we have seen in Donald Trump's, they say that when Napoleon escaped Elba and marched on Paris, that the Grande Armée rose up around him as the peasants came out of the villages and towns carrying pitchforks and stakes and whatever they could hold. Donald Trump is a phenomenon, and his connection with the electorate, his ability to mobilize his supporters. As a marginal seat campaigner, I look at it, I am in awe. And then you show me a guy like Joe Biden, you know, whose face was covered for the entire campaign, who lived in a basement, whom every time he did open his mouth, his entire team had you know, were petrified of, you know, whether he could remember the opening words to the American Constitution, whether he could complete a sentence, whether he knew what city or state he was in. He couldn't conduct a single press conference open to journalists, and yet, you know, Joe Hockey, the Australian ambassador to the US, made the practical point that the US Constitution places in the hands of each legislature the right to set up the voting laws and rules for what is a valid vote. That means you get 50 different sets of rules, in some cases down to the county level, so you get extraordinary complexity. We find somebody like, what's his name, little, you know, when the Jews go bad, they go really bad, as in Captain Facebook, Zuckerberg. You know, he rocks up and gives, I think, was it 250 million, maybe 300 million on voter mobilization, you know, initiatives. You got 450, I mean, I forget the number of Biden-only ballots that were cast, which immediately, somebody is saying, okay, I'm motivated enough to go and cast a ballot, but I'm not motivated enough to vote for anyone else except for Joe Biden. You've got hundreds of thousands of those Biden-only votes, heavily concentrated in the swing states and counties. Look, I think there's plenty of reasons why a rational person may be sceptical of this result. The only other thing I will say is it may well be that this kind of compromising of the ballot has probably been going on for a very long time. It's not necessarily a purely Trump phenomena. The last thing I would say is if you doubt the will of powerful organised forces to rig an election, the thing that kind of tipped me over is what Google, Amazon, Facebook and Twitter did immediately after the election, you know, where they simply went through and purged millions of sincere voices because they didn't want to corrupt their algorithm with any counter opinions. So, yeah, I don't mind admitting to you that I'm sceptical about the result.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, we'll go to audience questions. Ron, you were first up, so please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good evening, Ross. Hi, my name is Ron. Nice to meet you. Thank you. I would like to ask you your opinion, your comments about what I'm suggesting. There's a lot of hand-wringing going on about Australia's position with regard to exports that have been, they've had a lot of trouble with China and so on. What would happen if we formed a new bloc with countries that are strong with knowledge-based economies, who want to advance knowledge-based economies, and all have, importantly, Western-type legal systems? I'm referring to Australia with India, Australia, of course, Israel and Singapore. They all have Western types, and they've got a population of about 1.25 billion together. Without repudiating other alliances that we have, these countries all have Western type legal systems. They all have ex-British connections. So I'd like your opinion and comments about forming such a bloc, especially with research development. We've got excellent academics, all of us, good research facilities, and we all have, as I said, Western legal system that makes a huge difference with IP and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes Western legal systems, as I say, in the case of Assange, demonstrates that they make less difference today than they may have once. And that's from somebody who, I mean, I love the British common law. I mean, I feel immensely grateful for Blackstone's commentaries. I like the fact that Alfred the Great's will says that, you know, his wish is that an Englishman should remain as free as his own thoughts. But if you look at the extent to which, you know, thought is being persecuted throughout the Western world, if you look at the narrow range of views which a person may hold if they wish to retain a job in any Fortune 500 or G100 company, I mean, you effectively have to lobotomize your opinions if you wish to hold a job in corporate Australia. So I don't attach the same level of value to the judicial system that you know, once existed. Indeed, you know, as I participated in the visit to Australia of Milo Yiannopoulos, you know, the Victorian government sent us a $50,000 bill for the security that they say they were required to provide. And this is just a deliberate attempt by the Victorian government to stamp out alternative opinion. So even though I defend Daniel Andrews on the Belton Road, but I am hugely critical of his authoritarian impulses, though he's not that different to the other state premier. Having said that, I want to trade with everyone. I would take the Lang Hancock view. He said, you know, I'm happy to sell iron ore to South American dictators who are oppressing their own people, because I don't regard it as my job to run the foreign policy of Nicaragua. And in the same way, we find throughout history that it has been the merchants and the traders who have done the most to build goodwill between people of different cultures, languages, and religions. And in truth, you know, the merchants are a much more moral class than the statesmen as a general principle. So if you say to me, you want to see greater engagement with India and Israel and Singapore, I say, brother, I'm 100,000% with you. The very first thing I would do is I would go to Israel and say, well, look, 70% of Australia has been a desert since we arrived here. And presumably for the last 10,000 years of Aboriginal occupation, nobody has understood how to harvest water in a desert better than the Israelis. So let's make a joint compact to make an additional 1% of the Australian continent arable every year for the next 10 years. That's what I would do.
Okay. All right, thank you. Now we've got Reuven, Ailey and Jeff. Just a reminder, please keep the questions brief so that we can get through everybody. Thanks, Reuven. Just unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go away. Go ahead.
My question, okay, so as far as boycotts, I mean, we want to be experts of it, but the situation in Iran, they've become very much more emboldened since Biden has come in. They've already started attacking and using the proxies. Biden has straight away said, well, 25,000 troops, additional troops there straight away. But he wants to negotiate. My understanding, he wants to negotiate with Iran deals to stop the development of nuclear weapons, and Iran says, no, we're not going to negotiate, no negotiation, etc. Do you believe Australia will be called upon for a contribution by Biden to send our troops back there again?
Look, I think Iran is a vitally important question. I don't know what Biden is going to do. I accept the fact that of the detractors and enemies of Israel, that the clerical leadership of Iran there seems to be a virtually unanimous consensus that it represents the single greatest threat. There is a fair bit of dispute about what Iran's capabilities are. And indeed, the WikiLeaks revealed the whole range of internal communications, in particular between the Russian military, the US, the French and others, where Iran acquired a certain amount of engine technology from North Korea, some nuclear technology from Pakistan. There was a question about what its capability to project a missile with what type of warhead might be. All of that requires very careful and detailed study. But I just put all I know is, over the course of my lifetime, Iran has been this difficult rogue state. Obviously, Iran represents a threat because of the proxies which it funds, not least of which is Hezbollah. Yet I find myself in this extraordinary situation, for example, in Syria, you know, where we were fighting on the side of the Islamic supremists, and Hezbollah was fighting against Islamic State. We were promoting Al-Qaeda inside of Syria when Hezbollah was having to carry draped coffins through the hills of Lebanon week after week with dead Hezbollah soldiers who had died fighting Islamic State. So, you know, let's admit that the original Obama deal, as I understand it, you know, $1.5 billion in cold, hard euros sitting on a pallet in an airport in Tehran, heaven knows where it wound up. Let's assume that, you know, I want to hold the feet to the fire of the Iranian leadership. I also take no pleasure in the fact that, you know, because Iran no longer has the capability to refine its own fuel, you've got 80 million people, 50 million in the city of Tehran, 20 million children each day inhaling poison because they can't refine fuel. I think I would like to see a very high level of attention and concentration going to resolve the Iran problem. I take no pleasure in our sanctions poisoning 20 million Iranian children, but I accept the fact that, you know, even after Ahmadinejad, the Iranian leadership has done very little to build confidence that they wish to participate, you know, as a civilized member of the family of nations.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Ailey, your turn.
Hi, can you hear me?
Whoops, a lot of echo there, Ailey.
You have to. It's David's microphone. Okay. Hi, Ross. Coming back to the US election, why wouldn't the US Supreme Court hear the evidence of fraud? And why couldn't Trump actually get a legal remedy?
Yeah, well, this is the problem for somebody like me who is frankly skeptical about the US election result. Then that means I have to also implicate the US Supreme Court. Now, I did go to the trouble of reading the appeal from the state of Texas, which I found, I must admit, absolutely compelling in its legal analysis. And if I give you the 20-second summary, I mean, the state of Texas said, well, look, the Constitution of the United States gives to the legislatures of the states the exclusive power to establish the voting rules of that state. and we had governors, Democratic governors, in 5 swing states in the lead up, in sort of in the 12 months before the election, who took the opportunity of COVID to completely rewrite the electoral rules for what is a valid ballot, in every case, vastly liberalising, in particular, the mail-in ballots, but not only, also in relation to voter identification. And the state of Texas just said, well, those 5 swing states all fell the other way. All of them had vast numbers of mail-in ballots, which is, which is the only reason why Donald Trump can get more votes than any Republican candidate for president in history and still lose. It's only because of the millions and millions of mail-in ballots. And Texas just said to the Supreme Court, well, we wish the opportunity to put to you the idea that all of those changes to the electoral law of those key swing states were entirely unlawful. And it seemed to me, on a pretty simple reading of the proposition, that that was obviously the case, because those governors have no legal power to alter the electoral law. Now, the Supreme Court is then put in the same position, effectively, as the FBI was put in relation to the Hillary Clinton 30,000 leaked and bleached and destroyed with a hammer emails, that you're effectively asking an agency of the state to decide the electoral result. And the agencies of the state are inclined to look at it. The Supreme Court looks at it and says, rather than upholding the Constitution and the rule of law, we don't wish to be held responsible for changing the election result. And so they welched, they blinked, they said, we're not going to interfere because we don't want to be responsible for the carnage that will follow.
Yeah. Okay, Jeff, your question, please. Please unmute yourself, and then we've got iPhone.
Greetings, Ross. Great to hear your voice again. We are indeed living in interesting times, as the Chinese curse has it, but more important perhaps is the fact that the socialists over the last 4.5 years have so dominated the media that there is no room for anybody to get excited about any one of the hundreds and hundreds of outrages, from the criminalities of their major players to the outrages of the other media. And we are so ensconced in socialism that it is unbelievable. We have never heard a situation, and this is where my question ends, whereby you've got hundreds of prima facie criminalities and outrages committed, and nobody has got the strength, courage, or the wherewithal to take up any one of them because there's too much of it. So I seem to be criticizing our side of politics, but it's actually not fair, because there is just too much of it, and nobody can cope with a mountain of outrages, from the criminality of the other side to the outrages committed against Trump. I give up. Quite frankly, I give up.
Yeah, well, it's just as well that Joshua didn't take that approach as he came to the promised land. But I understand the sentiment, I understand the sentiment. And indeed, what we are seeing is a dissolution of historical boundaries in politics, where we might have thought there was a battle between Republicans and Democrats, or Liberal and Labor. What we now see is that there is a vast coalition where the biggest corporations realised that if they could do a deal with the state, with the big state, with the deep state, if you could put together a coalition which involved the major technology companies, of which you only need to control half a dozen. I mean, if you've got Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you've basically got a lockup on social media. And so then you say, well, that group is going to go ahead and do a deal with the state bureaucracies, with the intelligence services, with academia, with the trade unions. Once you put that coalition together, you actually don't really need citizens anymore. You don't, as a business, you don't even really need customers anymore. So now you've got Australian banks who are saying, well, if you don't have an appropriate climate change mitigation policy, we are not going to lend you money. And so you've got a fully politicized corporate academic world. And, you know, the intelligence services don't mind so long as they can keep feeding Lockheed Martin and Thales Underwater Systems. We can keep the permanent war going on. We can turn every minor threat. I mean, the woman, the one who I've got a massive crush on in the United States Congress is a Democrat, Tulsi Gabbard. And she has just made an absolutely compelling and impressive statement in relation to John Brennan, who, like, you know, Joe Biden, I mean, I don't wish to be mean. I wish I could be cheering for my own side. But the truth is these guys have gone into business against the citizen. And they have realised that if you can get the media will say, for example, I mean, there's no doubt that all of Hunter Biden's problems, I don't want to rub the bruise, I don't take any pleasure in it, but there's no doubt that all of the emails were authentic, that all of the problems were real, but the media will just enter into a pact of silence and to agree to look the other way. So I suspect we're going to see very, very minimal accountability for performance from the Biden administration.
Yeah. Okay, time for one last question, and an iPhone, it's you, so please unmute yourself. And I imagine you don't have a camera.
I do. It's Rafi Lam here. How you going?
Hi, Rafi. Welcome.
Sorry, I don't know why my name doesn't come up. G'day, Ross. A quick one that maybe I'm keen to continue offline at some point with you, but you know, I get the sense that Facebook, Twitter, etc., are going to be fairly emboldened with the success of their, you know, not so subtle interventions leading into the US election. And as we look into a potential Aussie election, maybe in October this year, and you know, to some degree, it's the same situation. Israel coming up. You know, what can we on the Conservative side do to prevent them effectively undermining the information flow going to the public, going to the election?
Yeah.
Both on a sort of no-cost activist basis and then on a more kind of intense, you know, aggressive campaign sort of basis.
Well, look, you're asking, Rafi, I think, the most important immediate question. I mean, the truth is, I hate wasting my brain space thinking about, you know, what to do about these daft billionaires who, since they have no God, need to find, you know, a moral cause. But the problem is rich and dumb is a very dangerous combination. And that's what we're getting out of these guys. I think that Marcus Aurelius, our favourite Roman emperor, said that if a person refrains to express their opinion out of fear, they are like a soldier who has deserted their post. And, you know, I'm here tonight in part out of just an immense respect for the sort of Jewish achievement over several thousand years. But secondly, because I regard it as my civic duty to express my opinion. And where the thing collapses is where Conservatives sell out, which I regret to say is, you know, a very significant feature of both Australian and American politics. And indeed, when Donald Trump wanted to pardon Julian Assange, it wasn't the Democrats who threatened him, but Mitch McConnell. He said, we'll make sure you are sacked and impeached if you pardon Assange. But secondly, it's private citizens who are constantly facing this apparent decision to choose between their conscience, their sincere belief, and their sort of economic and worldly interests. And I just say, all of us make compromises every day, none of us without hypocrisy. But my advice to you is to speak as honestly, as frankly, let's say with courtesy, if possible, but to express your own opinion, because it's the most precious thing you possess.
Okay. And on that very philosophical note, we're going to have to call it time for tonight. Ross, thank you for being so open and generous with your time this evening. We love your work and appreciate your support in these times of crazy political correctness. So thank you again for joining us this evening. It was great.
Shalom. My pleasure.
And with that, I'll just hand back to David to make a few closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ross. Very, very interesting discussion, and we do record this, Ross, so we can measure whether it's comes true during the year or not, and maybe have you back late in the year if you're willing, and we'll compare what you've said with what's actually unfolded, which will be fun. It is International Holocaust Remembrance Day today, so we should acknowledge that, and one of the we have put information on our social media, and one of the things that we should do is to exercise our freedoms, and today is a demonstration of doing exactly that. Donald Trump is not the only leader who is being censored by social media, and indeed Bibi Netanyahu was censored within the last 2 or 3 days when Facebook disagreed with how he wanted to manage a certain coronavirus issue in Israel with the use of information. Final thing to say is just to look at what's coming up next week. And before doing that, I'm going to show you one picture which goes to what our guest is going to talk about next week. This is a quote from 1948 when Jordan occupied the old city of Jerusalem and basically said that none of the Jewish buildings remain intact and it would be impossible for Jews to return. Well, perhaps next week we have someone who is devoting themselves to the opposite of that. The title next week is called Make Jerusalem Jewish Again, with Daniel Luria, who's the Executive Director of Ateret Kohanim, an organisation which is involved in acquiring properties that are owned by Arabs in Jerusalem and essentially expanding the Jewish footprint in the Holy City, doing it legally, doing it commercially. It's a complex and interesting project, and we will hear about that next week. And finally, we always ask for your support. The AJA needs your support. If you are not yet doing it, please like and follow the Facebook page. If you're not yet on our email list, just send your name to office@jewishassociation.org.au. And membership is only $25 for the year, but of course we welcome donations as well, and that can be done via the website jewishassociation.org.au. So that's it, Alan.
Okay.
Another great event, and thank you all.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ross. And thank you to everybody for joining us. So until we see you next week at the same time, it's good evening to you all. Bye for now.